impressed with the amazing realization that I was very much following the footsteps of the most influential and consequential man who ever walked the earth.
Well, I finally made it to the north of Israel, near Dan, at a place called Caesarea Philippi. Now, this is a large archaeological site containing elaborate building projects by Herod Philip and Herod the Great's grandson, Agrippa II. Heard it's supposed to rain today.
In addition to magnificent Roman structures, Caesarea Philippi is also known for banyas, a collection of springs, and pagan worship sites linked to the cult of Pan. Pan, also called the goat god, was the Greco-Roman god of nature, livestock, and hunting, all things related to wild times, party music, and of course, fertility. Pan was the crazy-looking guy with the hindquarters, legs, and horns of a goat.
The centerpiece of this ancient worship site is this huge cliff and grotto containing the remains of numerous altars, caves, temples, and courtyards. This whole area was teeming with Roman mythology and idolatry. It was right here where Jesus, nearing the end of his ministry, asked his disciples one profound question: who do you say that I am?
Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Matthew 16:13 through 18.
This dramatic scene in the Gospels is commonly referred to as Peter's confession. Now, the disciples had walked with Jesus for about 3 years. They had listened to his teachings. They had witnessed his miracles. They had come to know Jesus as a man. But Simon Peter had come to understand that Jesus was the long-awaited Jewish Messiah.
Jesus responded by blessing Simon. He changed Simon's name to Peter, the Rock, and declared that he would build a church on this rock, a church so solid that not even Hades itself would overcome it.
Now, that huge cave adjacent to the temple of Pan was considered to be the gateway to Hades. In Greek mythology, Hades was the god of the underworld. By the time of the Romans, Hades was considered to pretty much be the underworld itself. Occult worshippers believed that this open pit provided some kind of a gateway, access to the abode of the dead. Sacrifices were made here to appease the guardians of the underworld.
To the Jew, Hades represented the present pit in the heart of the earth, a place where the souls of the dead were confined and awaiting judgment.
In the context of this ancient occult location, the power of Jesus' statement really comes through. The gates of Hades will not overcome the church that will be built in his name. Okay, so what about Jesus' use of the word rock here at Caesarea Philippi? The debate rages on as to whether or not the rock that Jesus will build his church is referring to Peter or to Jesus himself.
The first view is that Jesus was declaring that Peter would be the rock on which he would build his church. In that case, Jesus was using a play on words. You are Peter, Petros, and on this bedrock, Petra, I will build my church.
Since Peter's name means rock, and since Jesus was going to build his church on bedrock, one school of thought is that Jesus was linking the two together.
Later in history, Peter does become a primary foundation of the church. It is Peter who first proclaims the gospel on the day of Pentecost and was the first to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And later we can see from the testimony of the early church that Peter was widely considered as the leader of the church. In a sense, Peter was the rock foundation of the church. Another interpretation is that the rock Jesus spoke of wasn't Peter, but Peter's confession and proclamation of Jesus as Messiah. In this sense, it's the gospel message that Jesus is Lord that serves as the church's foundation. In the eyes of many, this view is another way of saying Jesus himself is the foundation.
Peter's declaration of faith, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," led Jesus to declare that he was the rock, the bedrock, the cornerstone, the foundation upon which he would build his own church. Jesus' identity as the Christ, the Messiah, was the bedrock that would support everything else.
But what came next must have truly baffled his disciples. In Matthew 16:20, Jesus orders them, "Do not tell anyone that I am the Messiah."
Now put yourself in the disciples' sandals for just a minute. Over the course of their time with Jesus, they'd seen him control the weather, heal people, cast out demons, baffle the experts, mesmerize crowds of thousands, walk on water. And they now finally believed him to be the long-awaited Jewish Messiah who would cast off Roman oppression and usher in the new Jewish kingdom. And they were his best friends. Now, I know what I'd be thinking. Let the good times roll. Except that's not how the scripture reads. According to the Bible, that little party lasted for about 8 seconds.
From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are a stumbling block to me." Matthew 16:22 and 23.
And so here, for the first time, Jesus revealed his plan to his disciples. And it's clear, by Peter's reaction, that they weren't exactly prepared for this new revelation, that Jesus, their leader, their friend, who did all those amazing things, was now going to suffer and die. Now, Jesus did say that he would be raised from the dead, but I think it's possible that they might have missed that part with the words "suffer and die" still ringing in their ears. Peter just simply couldn't understand it all, and the Gospels record that he began to rebuke Jesus.
Jesus' response was pretty interesting. Well, interesting to us 2,000 years later. I don't think interesting is the word Peter would choose to describe it, though, especially right after Jesus told him, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." "Get behind me, Satan," Jesus said.
As incomprehensible as it may have seemed to his disciples, Jesus knew he was going to suffer, and apparently it was his plan to allow it to happen. And he wasn't going to allow anyone, not even one of his closest friends, to get in the way.
About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. Luke 9:28 through 36. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Do not tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Matthew 17:9.
This event in the Gospels is called the Transfiguration. Now, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, a transfiguration is a change of form or appearance, especially one that glorifies, beautifies, and makes more spiritual. Now, this event of the Transfiguration was the capstone of Jesus' public life. While his baptism was the starting point of his public ministry, the Transfiguration was the peak, the culmination of his public ministry. Now, the experience of the Transfiguration gave Peter, James, and John a glimpse of heaven in order for them to be strengthened for the terrible suffering that was to come. And we can only imagine what this experience would have been like for the disciples, but it must have been pretty astonishing because it's written that the disciples were very afraid. Now, here's another question. Of all the significant figures available in the Hebrew Scriptures, why was it particularly Moses and Elijah that showed up? Well, one popular theory is that Moses represented the law and Elijah represented the prophets.
So when God's voice from heaven said about Jesus, "Listen to him," that indicated that the law and the prophets must now give way to Jesus, who will replace the old way with the new way. He is the completion of the law and the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament.
A theory as to the whole purpose of this entire event was that it gave the inner circle of Jesus' followers a greater understanding of who Jesus really was. The apostles, who had only known Jesus in his human body, now had a greater understanding of his deity. This also gave them the reassurance they needed after the shocking revelation of his coming death.
It's also interesting to note the symbolism that exists in this event. As Jesus meets with Moses and Elijah, it's recorded that they spoke of his departure. Moses had led his own departure, or exodus, out of Egypt almost 15 centuries earlier. Also, 2 Kings records that Elijah departed this earth in a flaming chariot. Jesus had miraculously provided bread for the multitudes in the story of loaves and fishes we covered in our last episode, just as Moses provided bread, or manna, in the wilderness to the Israelites. And when Moses came down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments, you may remember that his face was shining with the glory of God, just as Jesus' face was now shining with the same glory. To one familiar with the Hebrew Bible, these parallels would have been extraordinarily meaningful.
The disciples, they never forgot what happened on the mountain that day. This was no doubt intended. John wrote in his gospel, "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only."
We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. 2 Peter 1, 16 through 17.
Now, the gospel accounts are silent as to the exact identification of the mountain where Jesus underwent the Transfiguration, but there are two sites that have historically been considered strong possibilities. Mount Tabor, the top of which I'm standing right now, is the earliest traditional site for the Mount of Transfiguration, a tradition established by 3rd century Christian scholar named Origen. The site was later confirmed by a Latin priest and historian named Jerome, along with a theologian named Cyril of Jerusalem in the 4th century AD. By the 5th century, Christian structures were being built up here to commemorate the site.
Mount Tabor isn't a very big mountain at 1,886 feet. However, it stands alone in the area and was considered very strategic high ground throughout the centuries. The mountain is located at the eastern end of the Jezreel Valley, 11 miles west of the Sea of Galilee. During the time of Jesus, Mount Tabor was the landmark for an important junction on the Roman highway known as the Way of the Sea. It marked the connector road up to Damascus. The other main possibility for the location of the Transfiguration is Mount Hermon. At 9,232 feet, this mountain is the highest in the area. It is also near Caesarea Philippi, where the previous events recorded in the Gospels took place. Some scholars believe that Mount Hermon better conforms to the record than the traditional sites on Mount Tabor, but we just don't know. My time investigating the Gospel accounts of the Transfiguration was powerful. Now it's time to drive down the mountain and return to Jesus' home base of Capernaum on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee.
So, a little review is in order. You will recall that Jesus and his disciples had just been in the region of Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus had told them that he must, quote, go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. They then had their mountaintop transfiguration experience, and then, shortly thereafter, returned here to Capernaum.
After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" Matthew 17:24. The annual temple tax was collected each spring from Israelite males aged 20 and older. The practice at Jesus' time had been going on for over 1,400 years, starting with Moses, where he collected money for the tent of meeting. By the 8th century BC, this money was now considered an annual tax levied to support the temple built by Solomon in Jerusalem. According to the Jewish Mishnah, this temple tax continued throughout the temple's history to support daily operations, repairs, and improvements. No matter where an Israelite man was living in the world, he was responsible for the annual tax to support the temple in Jerusalem.
In an earlier part of the gospel story, Jesus proclaimed authority over the temple by driving out the money changers. That's probably what prompted the local tax collectors to ask Peter whether or not Jesus pays the tax himself. What better way to test Jesus' teaching on the temple in Jerusalem than to challenge his disciples on their home turf here at Capernaum? Peter answered, yes, Jesus pays the tax, and then quickly searched out Jesus in order to find out what to do.
In order to prevent the temple tax from becoming an issue, Jesus instructed Peter to pay the tax on behalf of both of them. Rather than taking the money from, say, the disciples' petty cash fund, Jesus had more unconventional instructions for Peter. So that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch. Open its mouth and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. Matthew 17:27.
You know, I have to wonder if the disciples at this point sometimes just had to shake their heads and say, all right, Jesus, if you say so. And so wouldn't you know it, Peter went to the lake, dropped in a line, and they caught a fish with the exact amount in its mouth needed for the temple tax. I also wonder if Peter, after all he had seen following Jesus, was even surprised or not.
Historically, the best-known fish in the Sea of Galilee is the Tilapia galilea. Locals refer to this tilapia as either amnon in Hebrew or musht in Arabic. Amnon appears to be derived from 2 Aramaic words meaning mother fish, because it cares for its young in its mouth.
Not that it makes Peter's story any less amazing, but even today in the Sea of Galilee, you can find that fish with small pebbles or bottle caps in its mouth. Yummy.
During the springtime in the shallow waters near Capernaum, these fish congregate to spawn. Once the eggs have been fertilized, they grab up the eggs in their mouths and carry them around for weeks until they hatch. This fish is known locally as St. Peter's fish because of this story in the Gospels. Speaking of local coinage, a number of historical figures mentioned in the Gospels minted their own coins, many of which survive to this day. Political officials minted coins with a variety of designs and inscriptions, usually referring to themselves or to the Roman emperor of the time. Caesar Augustus is mentioned in Luke chapter 2, verse 1. Emperor Augustus minted many coins in many different designs. This coin shows a profile of him with the phrase Divine Augustus. Tiberius Caesar is mentioned in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, and also appears on quite a few coins. This silver denarius, commonly called the tribute penny, depicts Tiberius in profile with the surrounding inscription Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. Because Tiberius was the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus, this is the coin many believe Jesus was holding when the Pharisees tried to trap him into saying something incriminating about Rome's tax system. His famous response was this: "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Herod the Great, who is first mentioned in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, also issued his own coins. This bronze pruta shows a ceremonial bowl sitting on a tripod. It also has a Greek inscription that reads, "Of King Herod." Herod also displayed other objects such as this helmet, palm branches, and star. Herod Antipas, tetrarch of the Galilee region, is mentioned throughout the ministry of Jesus. This is the Herod mentioned during the trial of Jesus. The front of this coin shows a palm branch surrounded by the Greek words Herod Tetrarch. Another prominent character in the gospel story is Pontius Pilate, who is first mentioned in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Pilate minted coins that honored the Roman emperor Tiberius. This coin shows the Greek words Tiberius Caesar surrounding a curved wand important in Roman mythology. For anyone who loves history, ancient coins provide awesome evidence for the famous rulers we read about. Here in Israel, numerous coins have been discovered that establish the characters in the Gospels as real people in history. Soon after the seemingly inconsequential event with the fishy money at Capernaum, Jesus left Galilee for the last time. Galilee had been the setting for his greatest teachings and most memorable miracles, but the master clock was ticking. It was time for the final chapter in Jesus' mission, a final confrontation. According to Luke, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Something new and purposeful was in the air. According to Mark, they were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Mark 10:32. The disciples' fear was palpable. Why did this trip to Jerusalem feel so much different?